Hey everybody, my name is Alex, and this is Bento Radio. Now, before we jump into what we're talking about today, I just wanted to go over a couple things up top here. Just the usual stuff. If you really like this podcast, if you're watching it on YouTube, be sure to scroll down and hit the subscribe button, as well as the notification bell. And if you really like this in particular episode, be sure to drop it a like and leave a comment below telling me what you think. All of that really helps the channel, and if you hit that notification bell, you'll get notified whenever new episodes drop, or whenever really anything drops. I've got some plans for some stuff, maybe in the future, that might not line up with the weekly thing. But that means more stuff for you, so that's good. But if you really love this and you want to dive deeper, you can always go to bento-box.ghost.io. There's a link basically everywhere. If you're listening to this, it will be in the description of the podcast at the bottom of every episode. If you're watching this, it will be in the description of the video at the bottom. It will also be in the description of the YouTube channel if you can't find it one or other places. It should also be in the description of the actual podcast on whatever podcast platform you're watching this on. So definitely go check out bento-box.ghost.io. And the last thing I want to shout out is the artist interviews I've been doing for the past couple months. I'm trying to keep a clip of one a month. I'm a little bit flying by the seat of my pants here. We'll see if that is possible with December, but I reached out to some people. I'm working on some stuff, so hopefully that all worked out and I get to drop another artist interview as an episode. And if you like those, but maybe you haven't watched all of them, I encourage you to go watch whichever one you've missed. There are 3 in total. If you've watched 2, watch the third one. If you've watched 1, watch the other 2. If you haven't watched any of them or listened to any of them, I encourage you to go check those out, because it's me, a person who has a degree of specific art-related degree in graphic design, talking to artists about their process. So it's not like I try to make them much less high-minded, although there is some stuff in there that's pretty high-minded, but I try to make it much more like a conversation between 2 creative people about what it's like to make stuff in all of this and what that means. So I'm really proud of all 3 of them. Definitely go check them out, rather. You can find them on the YouTube channel or wherever you're listening, so go check that stuff out. You can also find treats for them on bento-box.ghost.io. And over there I do a little bit of a write-up. I also provide a link across everything to the best place to find that artist's work. 2 of them in its Instagram. For Jess in particular, she has her own website, which rules. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. It's different for every artist. But all that info is in those individual posts. It's also in the description of each of those episodes wherever you find them, but I do a little specific write-up for each individual post over on bento-box.ghost.io. But on that note, let's jump into what we're talking about this week, and that's a little show from last season. From, at very least, last year. Actually, I think it is the summer season, and that's a show called Ruri Rocks. So I'm going to toss it over to my lovely assistant, to give us a plot synopsis, and then we'll jump back into it with my thoughts. So take it away,
After Ruri Tanegawa falls in love with a necklace at the mall with her friend Aoi, she's quickly shot down by her mother when she tries to get an advance on her allowance or her mother to buy it for her. Ruri takes matters into her own hands and sets out to find her own gems with her cell phone and plastic shovel when she meets Nagi, and begins to learn there's more to mineralogy than crystals and gems. Over the 13-episode run, she discovers a deep love for earth science, and mineralogy in particular, that she comes to share with friends, both old and new.
Now that we're out of the plot synopsis zone, thank you so much, for that, I want to start in a weird place here, because the existence of this show and one other show are interesting. I'm not going to say entirely unique, but interesting. Because of the way they were made, and specifically who made them. So I'm going to pose a question to you. If you build a thing expressly to make one specific property, what does that mean? What happens, not just, let's say you make that, the thing you built, the studio you put together expressly to make that show. What happens afterwards? That's a very interesting, odd thing to have happen. It doesn't happen very often because those projects don't come around very often. I promise this will make sense in a second. Because the studio that made Ruri Rocks wasn't formed just as an animation studio to do projects the way many studios are. It wasn't even formed as a studio that's in it for necessarily the art of it. Although that is certainly part of it. That's part of all that is part of any animation studio venture, especially in the anime space. But the studio that was made, that produced Ruri Rocks, and there's one other show they've produced to date. It's the one about older brother turning into an older sister because of a younger sister's science experiments on him while he's asleep. Something insane. But those two shows are the off-season productions of Studio Bind. If you don't know a whole lot about Studio Bind, here's what I've gathered in my travels across the information superhighway, so to speak. Studio Bind was formed as a studio specifically from Studio White Fox and Studio Egg Firm, and it was made exclusively to make Jobless Reincarnation. Now, say what you want about Jobless Reincarnation. It's one of the more popular shows I've talked about on my podcast. You can go watch the video on YouTube. And if you're a subscriber, there's a large chance you already have, actually. Or you can, if you're a subscriber in audio form, you can listen to my thoughts over there, too. But that show is made with such care and attention to detail and craft that it makes sense that a studio was built to make it. But the question you gotta ask is, why was a studio built to make it? And that's because if you're not aware of, and this is pretty easy not to be aware of this kind of stuff, more easy than if you are aware of it, you might think. But if you're not aware, Jobless Reincarnation became pretty quickly, from when it was published originally as a web novel, not even a manga or a light novel, or now 2 seasons of anime, but as a web novel, when it was originally published, it quickly became a foundational piece of otaku culture for a bunch of different reasons. A lot of that having to do with its story tendencies and the way it treats its characters and the kinds of character archetypes it employed along its story. And I've now sat and listened to the entirety of the main part. I didn't get through the extra stories, but the entirety of the main story of Jobless Reincarnation, and it makes total sense to me why that story would resonate with the hardcore otaku crowd, because it has a lot of the kinds of things people like. But the reason why it resonates beyond that is actually because it has a lot more than that, and it has a scope of story that is so much more expansive than, I don't want to say than anime does, but then a lot of anime have been given space to be. And back in the olden times, when shonen weren't seasonal, and you'd get shows that ran for hundreds of episodes, it was much more a thing that you would get something, or even a piece of something where you weren't getting the whole thing, that would be part of a larger narrative. And so the studios and the industry was used to producing that stuff. Now you don't have as many pieces that feel like they've definitely earned that. Not that all of the stuff in the 90s and the 80s earned that, but Jobless Reincarnation was a prestige project in a way that we don't get a whole lot. Because it was, at the point at which the anime was about to be produced, it was a bestseller. It was proven multiple times. So when Studio Egg Firm and Studio White Fox looked at this, they kind of understood we've got to knock this out of the park, and the best way to do that is to really place our bets on it in a way that doesn't hold anything back. There's a show called Megalobox that was an anniversary project for specifically a Future Joe or Ashita no Joe, which is a old school, I think from the 70s, fighting manga turned anime that was a huge deal. It is foundational point for things like Hajime no Ippo, if you ever heard of that show and manga. But when they went to do a anniversary project, one of the things about anniversary projects that makes people so excited is they're explicitly prestige projects. They're things that aren't just made for the profit of it, but the art of it. Another version of a prestige project is the 6-episode long OVA, essentially, Gundam Unicorn. That was another thing that was like, this is to celebrate the history and the decades of Gundam. And in both those cases, they knocked that out of the park, because if you're going to set up a prestige project like that, you're going to go for it. In the case of Gundam Unicorn, it's just dripping in quality and beauty and incredible. Gundam Hathaway is actually similar along those lines. It's absolutely gorgeous. If you haven't seen Gundam Hathaway, it's on Netflix. Go watch it. I'll talk about it at some point, I'm sure. But in the case of Megalobox, which was the anniversary project for Ashita no Joe, they floored it, and they did some incredible things with that show. They made the entire show look like it was from the year 1995, except with modern design influences in the characters and the settings. The whole thing has this grungy, grainy feel to it that they refuse to release a cleaned up version of. It exists. A version of Megalobox without all the filters and without all the post-processing exists, but no one has any interest in getting that, because part of the artistry of the show, and actually Jujutsu Kaisen proves this later on down the line, is the work they did to pull that show back into the 90s in a real grungy, grimy way and make it feel like you're watching something from that time. Jujutsu Kaisen proves that this is a technique that is worth exploring and deploying when possible, with a lot of its flashback sequences in the Hidden Inventory arc in the most recent season, and the very beginning of the most recent season of that show. But my point is when prestige projects come around, oftentimes it benefits everybody involved to look at it and be like, hey, this thing rules. We want this thing to rule. It would be in our best interest if it ruled. So, in the case of these two studios who wanted to work on this giant, big, prestigious story and adapt it into an anime, they said, we're going to make a new studio. We're going to spin up a studio only for working on this. What's it going to do? It's going to handle this specifically and only this. At least that's how they announced it. I'm sure nobody starts a business like that and doesn't have a plan for its future. But they had such confidence that they could pull this off that they just did it. And the results of that are incredible. Say what you will about the story of Jobless Reincarnation, and specifically about Ruri as a character. They knocked that thing out of the park. It is one of the most beautiful things in any season it's ever in, and it is that consistently. And the story deserves it. I talk a lot about Ruri in the episode that I released on it, and I encourage you to go listen to that episode, because that character is written like someone who is damaged and finding their way to wholeness. And as somebody who's now listened to the entirety of the light novelization, I can tell you that never stops. He never gets all the way there, if that makes any sense. At least in the story that you see, he never gets all the way there. He always has character flaws, because that's the way people work. And then The show they did immediately after was I forget the name of the show about the brother who gets gender swapped by a science experiment from his younger sister. That show displayed a tendency that had not existed in popular out-front anime for a while, and it's this tendency of otakuisms in shows that are made not for the audience that exists, not for the biggest possible audience, but for a very niche audience that will deeply appreciate it and take it with them on into the future. And it's an approach that we don't get a whole lot anymore, because the scope of what anime is has narrowed a lot. As budgets have gotten bigger, as the medium has gotten more popular, we're getting more stuff that tries to triangulate how it can get the biggest audience possible. You see the same thing in Marvel movies. I just watched the first Iron Man over again, even in the second Iron Man, even in the third Iron Man movie. Those are much different films than the kinds of Marvel insanity we're getting now, which largely a lot of people like or don't like, but the world's kind of souring on. And the reason why that is, and the reason why shows like The Boys are doing in ways better than shows and properties from the Marvel universe, because if you look at The Boys, it has an opinion, and that opinion might be strong and might not be your taste, but it's an opinion. And it has peccadillos and weirdness and unevenness. There's this evening out effect that happens when you're trying to chase the specific, broad cultural appeal that things like the next big Marvel movie now have. And that removes a kind of passion from it. If you look at even older anime stuff, like Akira is regarded as a piece of the anime canon. And part of the reason why it's regarded as a piece of the anime canon is because it takes no prisoners. It is exactly what it wants to be at all times, regardless of what you might think. And that's important because if you look at the big shonen stuff, with the exception of Jujutsu Kaisen, I think that's part of the reason why Jujutsu Kaisen is so popular, there's very little edge in a lot of it. You can have stories all day about how good Demon Slayer is, but if you're an otaku who's been in it for a minute, like me, you watch that show, and it is bog standard samurai versus demon of the week kind of show. And yes, there's an overarching big bad guy, and yes, there's all this, but it's not. It's junk food. It's high quality junk food. Maybe even Michelin star junk food. But it's junk food. There's not a whole lot there. And I'm not saying that there should be or shouldn't be. But it's not. It feels well made, but it doesn't feel prestigious. And the thing about Studio Bind is they were built to make something that felt prestigious. They were built to make something as uncompromisingly as they could. And if you watch any of Jobless Reincarnation at all, you'll see that's what they did. Rudy is the character he is in the books, and in the light novel, in the books, and in the manga, and in the web novel, in the anime, for the most part. He is that character, and they don't shy away from it. And that's really important because it brings us to the universe where they make Ruri Rocks. Because Ruri Rocks hit the internet like a truck. And the reason why it hit the internet like a truck is because it is a premise that we're all pretty familiar with at this point. Through something like sports anime, or through something like what I like to call hobby-ganda anime. And I've been thinking about this a little bit because I've been thinking about it in the context of a piece that I'm taking forever to write, because I take forever to write long-form essay things sometimes. But essentially, hobby-ganda anime, as I'm going to call them, are Iyashikei anime that are pointed at a specific hobby of some kind. A perfect example of this is the show Yuru Camp. That show wants you to go camping like nobody's business. It wants you to buy a plane ticket, fly to Japan, buy camping gear, and just enjoy scenic views of Mount Fuji at campsites in the middle of the winter. I can't express to you how much it wants you to do that all the time. Another lesser-known example is actually a thing you can go find on Netflix called Surme Roma. And what is this show? This show is a hobby-ganda anime that is ostensibly a tourism guide for Japanese hot springs. And I'm making none of this up. The point of view of a time-traveling Roman bathhouse architect. Not a lick of that was made up, I promise you. And it's so much of a hobby-ganda thing, and most of them are like this, actually, that it features at the end a little short talking about what the episode talked about, but in real life. And wouldn't you like to travel here and have hot spring eggs? It's so strange. That's not the reason that thank you, Belle. That Ruri Rocks hit the scene like a truck. Hit the internet like a truck, so to speak. The reason why that happened is because Studio Bind brought over an element that it languished in and that made sense to languish in Jobless Reincarnation because of the way the story is written, because specifically of the way Rudy as a character is characterized and written throughout everything he's in. And that is, this show has some eyes on its entire female cast, to a degree that is uncomfortable. But I want to pitch you on why that's not only an okay thing, but probably a good thing. I listened to a podcast from a guy who's now on YouTube, but who started over on TikTok, a guy named Pearlmania. And they were talking specifically, there's an episode all about the exploitative industry of blue jeans, but they started with Sydney Sweeney. And one of the things that Pearlmania, not Mrs. Pearlmania, his wife, but Pearlmania specifically, Alex Pearlmania, specifically said was part of the reason why Sydney Sweeney is so popular is because they've removed sex and sexualization from so much of media that as soon as any of that is present, if someone is explicitly linked to that, you're giving permission to people to fawn over them. And if you think about it, when there was a time, and you can still go find these movies, when just there were sex scenes in movies. Game of Thrones was a much more sexually charged show than had ever been, than lots of people are used to now. In its later seasons, that stuff fell away more, probably because of story reasons. But even something that was on just cable television, like Mad Men, was explicitly more racy than so much of what you find now. But hear me out here. What's happened in that stuff's absence, it's not concentrated in places, but it is everywhere. Everything's a little horny now. If you haven't noticed. Everything's a little sussly horny now. A perfect example is if you look at the Demon Slayer movie, K-pop Demon Hunters. That movie's pretty horny. It's like Huntrix's reaction to the Saja boys when they first show up is so aggressively girl-biting down so hard she breaks her retainer while staring at freaking Michael B. Jordan in theater when she sees the first, what's it called, Black Panther movie, which is a real thing that happened. And to Michael B. Jordan's credit, he saw that social media post and he bought her a new retainer, which I find hilarious. It's so that ooga hot guy thing. They invented a new version of your eyes popping out of your head for it, and it's wild. And then there's the Rumi eating the sushi roll scene, which is insane. There's all this stuff all throughout media now that is horny as hell without admitting it, that when you're, but is lampshaded so it feels okay, that when it comes up and hits you in the face, lots of people just don't know what to do with it. It feels uncomfortable. And yes, there are certainly uncomfortable things because there are underage characters in this show, and the show has not nearly as much camera treatment of them as the over 18 college girls that it puts in the show, but it does have moments of that, and that's a gross feeling thing. But I want to put a stop to the idea that you shouldn't see anything that makes you feel gross. And I want to put it in context for you. So when I was making this set, I set up a whole set for myself because I knew I'd have to be on camera. And I picked everything you see in the set very specifically. Even if it was already hanging here, I made the explicit choice to not remove it and to not change it out. And part of the reason for that is this wall scroll, which I actually got in Akihabara, is insane. I have no doubt that its presence turns people who might watch this off of the video version, at the very least, if not off of the entire podcast. And if you're listening to this, I encourage you to go at least scrub through the video so you can see the insane wall scroll I have up. But the reason I kept it, the reason why I keep finding a reason not to change it, is because it represents a kind of freedom of expression that is explored for good and ill in not just anime but art, and should be allowed to be expressed in art. And I think can make stories more interesting and better, although I don't think that stuff necessarily matters in Ruri Rocks' case. I think it is part of the goal of the artists who are making this. You can tell that those artists love Nagi, the character who is, but both literally and figuratively, of much of the camera's lurid gaze of the character, of the female form in this show. And when everybody saw the first scene of this show and they saw the springiness, the Gainax level bounce that the animators were just giving to Nagi all but exclusively, everybody was like, wow. Maybe it wasn't, and I can confirm that it was both the animators and the story in the case of Jobless Reincarnation, but it was the animators too. The animators are having a glorious time with animating Nagi. Frame to frame, every time, I guarantee it. But much like Jobless Reincarnation, this is a hobby-ganda show with that level of skill and ability applied to it. So what you get is you get an opening that is one of the more beautiful openings that I've seen in a long time. You get a show that's unendingly gorgeous, and not just its display of the hobby of mineralogy and geology and the study of straight-up rocks, but of the entire presentation of the show. Ruri, as a character, is drawn with care and detail and focus that is equal but applied differently to Nagi or Shoko or Irumi, and I forget the gal character's name who comes in at the end. The third of the trio of the younger part of the cast, of the middle school part of the cast. But the show does such a good job of giving you a vibe of what it wants to be, of what it should be, and what the studio is capable of when they're not focused on the single thing that Studio Bind was made to do, once again, which is make Jobless Reincarnation from start to finish. That it's fascinating at first to watch, and then by the middle, you're in this hobby-ganda show that is all about mineralogy and the history of rocks, and how to track down a sapphire deposit, or how to use, I think it was called mineral radio, is the second to last episode. Although that's arguably the last episode. We'll get to the last episode in a second. But all of this stuff in a lesser show feels like something that's quite frankly not worth talking about. And these hobby-ganda shows very often thrive on being well made. If you look at Eurocamp, a lot of Eurocamp's pitch is, look at the Iyashikei times you can have just solo camping on the side of a beach in early fall. Wouldn't that be glorious and amazing? Here, go buy all this camping gear. We're detailing it all out for you. Go for it, kid. I will tell you, if you watch Eurocamp and you watch Ruri Rocks, and then you go watch Surme Rome, first off, that's a wild transition. But second off, you'll notice the precipitous drop in quality and therefore how much you care about it. And this isn't just a hobby-ganda show thing, this is also a sports anime thing. So much of the sports anime everybody watches are incredibly animated because that's part of pitching the sport. If you've ever watched sports, the difference between them is a ton. But baseball is regarded as boring, and hilariously in baseball, so much of the conversation around baseball, the modern sport, is like, how can we change it to make it less boring for the people who watch it, especially at home? Football is essentially a den of gambling at this point. But then you get to basketball. And basketball, if I was going to be into a sport, I would be into basketball. I'm not into sports. I'm a disabled art school grad who loves anime enough to talk about it on the internet to strangers. I am not a sports ball person. But if I was going to be into a sport, if I was going to pick one on purpose, it would be basketball. Because you watch basketball, and basketball has all the flair and amazingness, and soccer is a little similar to this, that is lacking in something like baseball or football or a lot of other sports, because the trick stuff that you see people do in basketball, you see them doing it during games, in reality. Learning how to play street basketball translates to being able to play professional basketball in a way that just doesn't happen with touch football or t-ball. And also in those other sports, there's not as much like tomfoolery you can engage in while in the middle of the sport. If you watch basketball games from the 90s when the Bulls were on fire, Dennis Rodman, there's a really famous picture of Dennis Rodman dunking the basketball in a wedding dress. That shit happened. That's wild. That has the epic, awesome showmanship of a shonen anime. And if you also did multiple sports animes about specifically basketball, and at least two of them are incredibly well regarded. Kuroko's Basketball and Slam Dunk are formative, not just sports anime, but shonen anime. And they follow those formulas and use them to incredible effect. In Iyashikei anime, in particular, once again, hobby-ganda anime, which is a portmanteau of hobby and propaganda, that secret sauce is in the quality of the storytelling and the attention to detail of building this nice, gentle time of not quite frictionless happiness, but something that feels like you would have a good time doing it. Nobody wants to watch a show about people looking in microscopes 24/7. So what Ruri Rocks does with its subject matter is it puts all the characters on these constant hunts for these minerals. And it does show the importance of bringing stuff back and of being careful and of giving and of doing the research to figure things out. But it spreads things out across the story in a way that always gives you something that you're watching little mini arcs. You're watching them hunt for sea glass. You're watching them hunt for opals. You're watching them hunt for a lot of stuff. But the long and short of it is that it's good at it. The show is good at holding your attention and building suspense, even with all of the technical science stuff. I had an advantage in understanding because I come from a background of having made jewelry and have members of my family who have also made jewelry, so I understand a lot of the mineralogy in the show. But hilariously, if you've seen the show, if you're watching this because you've seen the show and you're like, wait, are there really just sapphires in the earth like that? Not really. Like, yes, but also definitely no. Like, I think it was Geralt on Anime World Order, who also, like, jewelers and silversmiths and stuff like that, I believe, said, and he said this really correctly, they're finding once-in-a-lifetime stuff weekly. They're finding ocean ponds of opal. That's insane. And I like, occasionally I would stop and I would look stuff up. Like, wait, how much is a sapphire? Because they make sapphires seem like they're not expensive. They're expensive. But at some point while watching the show, I would just, looking up random precious minerals, be like, but how much is quartz, really? And quartz is fairly inexpensive, which is interesting to me because it has the application of being able to go on a watch, but that's neither here nor there. But that's part of it, if that makes any sense. Very few Iyashikei anime can pull off something like a show Flying Witch. That show's Iyashikei move is that it shows magic to be this very mundane and not useless, but incidental thing. And but it lulls you along the way with such Iyashikei vibes that it almost doesn't matter. For a hobby-ganda anime, I keep doing that with my hands because I like the idea of hobby-ganda. But for a hobby-ganda anime, the part of it is trying to pitch you on getting into it for the love of the game and what could possibly happen. So are you going to go out and find a little piece of sapphire and then triangulate over the course of months and get it right and just nail it and find a literal wall of sapphire embedded in a cliff? Probably not. But that's what this show does because it wants to show you the possibility space and inspire you with the possibility space. If you look at Guru Camp, every time they go to a campsite, almost every time it's open. There's a scene in that show where they happen upon an unguarded outdoor hot springs bath, and they just take a dip. That's not something that will necessarily happen to you, but it could. It's about selling the dream of the hobby they're highlighting and showing you why people enjoy this. And in this show, in Ruri Rocks, the function that Nagi plays, other than being just the absolute eye candy of the show, as previously mentioned, is she embodied the hopefulness of the show for what's possible, if that makes any sense. Ruri plays the viewer character who is just discovering this stuff, who is just getting into the hobby and just experiencing it for the first time. But doesn't know what the possibilities are, doesn't know what she's getting into, doesn't know why any of the stuff she's learning is important. She's just excited about, ooh, pretty rocks. And this comes into play with the show later on, and I'll get to that in a little bit. Nagi, as a character, embodies, I've moved beyond just pretty rock, and now I'm really interested in the actual storytelling that can happen alongside studying this stuff and figuring out where this sample came from, or where that gem originated from, or how this forms, or how this happens, and why this happens. And they've given great examples of this that inspire you to be like, holy shit, this is really cool. And the mark of a good hobby-ganda anime is actually that in the middle of an episode at some point, you think about getting into it a little bit. You're a step away from pulling up your phone and being like, but how much is a miner's axe? Real? How much is a mineralogy hammer? What kind of starter kit could I build to go into the woods and get some shit done? And this didn't quite do that for me, but very often I get the bug of, well, I know I hate camping, but I could go camping. Or Tomei Roma was definitely like, I'm going to a bathhouse when I go to Japan, and I went to a bathhouse in Ginza, and it was phenomenal. This exact thing happened to me. I swear to God. I went to a bathhouse. I was in Japan. It was the last leg of my trip, so I was in Tokyo for at least a full week. I was like, I want to go to a bathhouse. Let's make that happen. And so I looked up public bathhouses. There was one closer, but I found one in Ginza, and I took the train out to Ginza. I went to a bathhouse that is on a side street, out of the way, and you go in, you leave your shoes at the door, you give the lady $5, you put a coin in a in a locker to get your stuff out, you strip down with everybody else, and you just walk in, you wash yourself, and then you get in the bath. When I tell you that just like the act of being able to get in a bath and just hang out in a bath for a little bit, I was some of the happiest I've ever been in my life. Like, I believe the hype of Thermae Roma now. It is that good. Even a random one was that good to me. So good, in fact, that I got people packed on the Circle Line on my way back to my hotel that night. Did not give a shit. Smile did not leave my face. Partially because the people packing thing was like a thing I wanted to have happen to me at some point, so might as well. But also, that inconvenience did not matter to me. Like, you could not touch me. I was on cloud 9. At least until the next morning. That's the kind of enthusiasm you want a hobby-ganda anime to instill in you, that you are going to have that good a time with it. And Ruri Rocks really has an uphill battle there, because the stuff they're tackling is so scientific and so not fit, and so intentionally almost not fit into even close to everyday life. And that's another thing that lots of hobby-ganda shows have in common, but the good ones overcome like that, and that is that the hobby doesn't really fit into your life. If you look at Eurocamp, all of those girls are in middle school, high school. I think they're in middle school, actually. Outdoor camping by themselves is not a thing that they do. It's so not a thing that I think the pink-haired girl, I think her name is Sakura, not that, I'm probably getting that wrong, the one who wears the mustache in the opening, she has to camp in her car with her mom the first time she does it. And by the end, she's going on solo camping trips to different places. And a lot of that is possible because Japan is insanely safe, or builds itself as insanely safe, and is to a certain extent, especially if you're a native Japanese person. But once again, a lot of that is just the pure wish fulfillment the show is trying to pitch you on. It's not Ruri Rocks, and Ruri Rocks does this actually the least out of them that I can think of. Ruri Rocks and other hobby-ganda shows are not trying to pitch you on starting the hobby. They're trying to pitch you on the milestones that you'll hit once you've been in it for a while. If that makes any sense. And I want to stop here. I want to talk about a different show that I've talked about before. That is Iyashikei. And Iyashikei is a really interesting show because it's a show made by the industry for hardcore fans. And if you've seen my episode again, you can go watch it or listen to it. But that show makes no compunction about the obsessiveness of its characters. And in that way, this show makes no compunction about the obsessiveness of its characters. The Ruri Rocks opens up with Ruri, the titular character, discovering a new thing in herself of how focused she is on this necklace in this shopping center. And she's like, it's beautiful, it's incredible, I almost don't care about the fact that it's a necklace, I just want the gem. I just want the pretty rock. And the next thing they show you, her begging for allowance, and her mom said no, and she stamps away. And then she encountered Nagi. When oh wait, you can go find gems in the wild, like Pokemon? Let's go do it. And once Nagi recognizes the kindred spirit, she's like, hey, do you want to know more about this? Do you want to get into this? And Rory's like, absolutely. And big shonen collector type stuff. Think Pokemon and digital. Think Pokemon, actually, is a perfect example. I've talked about this a little bit on the show, have the problem of they build these universes around these concepts. Think Pokemon, think Digimon, think Pokemon and Yu-Gi-Oh! Specifically. And then they have to sell you on the idea that the entire world revolves around Pokemon, which is a little bit easier to sell you on than the fact that the entire world revolves around a card game, which is some shit they pull in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's insane. Because they want you to feel like it's cool to be obsessed with this thing. These hobby-ganda shows, however, do that in a different way. They focus on the hobby primarily, but they allow it to sit in the real world. So a perfect example of this, towards the very end of the show, in the hilarious Hot Springs episode, which is the very end of the show, there's all this discussion about Nagi turning down an offer of a job from a museum to be a rock and mineralogy specialist. And why that's a big deal is because there's not many jobs left that require the kind of credentials that, at that point, Nagi is pursuing, and Imari, the other main adult/college age character. And they have this whole conversation of, it's a little bit of a dying art, people still need this, and it's obviously still valuable, but like not a whole lot out there, unless you want to be a teacher, which Nagi at some point says that she does want to do. That's a much more realistic approach than everybody cares about rocks. And this is a thing that's similar in Eurocamp as well. In both shows, they make it pretty clear that the cast cares about this shit. But not necessarily everybody else does. People might have experience, but they don't in it on some level, but they don't necessarily super give a shit about it. And the reason why I brought up Genshiken, and Genshiken being a show that really highlights the obsessive quality of otaku, is because in America, where I'm recording this, the word otaku is a very specific meaning. It means you are an obsessive fan of the medium of anime. Specifically, animation from Japan. In Japan, it just means you're an obsessive fan. It could be of anime, it could be of trains, it could be of American culture, it could be specifically of 1950s rockabilly culture. I'm not kidding. And that widens that possibility a whole lot. So these characters are all kinds of rock and otaku, essentially. They are all a version of Bisky from Hunter x Hunter. Bisky is a character from Hunter x Hunter who's a gem hunter, essentially. Not essentially, she is. But they're all that. And the show is very careful to be like, hey, this stuff is really cool, but it's not the only shit out there. It's not what everyone is doing. And by the end of the show is full-throatedly being like, hey, there's not a whole lot of job opportunities in this, so you better goddamn love it. If you're going to go after it as a career, you better love it. And I think that's really cool. And it reflects people making it too, because when, like I said, the show hit the internet like a truck. Especially with the camera's obsession with Nagi's body. And with the camera and the animator's obsession with Nagi's body. And it spawns this phrase. It reminded everybody of this phrase, and that phrase was, in order to make great art, you need to be some kind of weird pervert. And there are tons that prove that. If you look at Ghost in the Shell, and you look at the original comic for Ghost in the Shell, a lot of that comic book is just women in 1980s leotard-style swimsuits and/or leotards covered in oil. Covered in not even normal oil, in baby oil. It's out of control. So much of the illustration style of those comics is just that. It's insane. If you look at so much of good to incredible things in anime, there is a kind of, this was definitely made by some kind of weird pervert, I just can't figure out how or why, to all of it. And that makes sense considering the big, beautiful show that Studio Bind was made to make Jobless Reincarnation. Did plenty of weird pervertness there, too. And also the other show, the one about the brother turning into a sister. Absolute weird pervert material. But I think that framing of you have to be a weird pervert to make great art does a disservice to the person making the art. Because that dismisses their obsessiveness as being like a kink. It's not. You don't make a show that looks like Ruri Rocks just because you want to animate the hell out of some boobs and some butts. You just don't. It happens in there, sure, obviously, but you don't make that thing just as a testament to Gynax Jiggle. That's only one aspect of it. And if you look at so much of the things described that made by people would be described that way, it all has some quality of beauty and incredible craft that is beyond just the idea of, well, this person was a pervert, so they made some real pretty ladies. Like, that's not the point of any of it. Even something like Mezzo Forte, or so much of that creator's work, which, if you don't know, Mezzo Forte was not made originally was not conceived of as spicy anime. It was not conceived of as an X-rated thing. The entire reason it got made was because Yasomi Umetsu agreed to put the spicy scenes in a way that could be removed later, just to have it made at all. He agreed. He did a Faustian bargain with the hentai issue in part of the industry to get his stuff made, both for Mezzo Forte and Kite. And what that done, unfortunately for him, is it tinted his work going forward in the idea that Dog is definitely a weird pervert. And you watch Wizard Barristers, and you are more surprised that it's not an H anime. You're just more surprised that it strikes you as weird that it's not. I'm sure from what I've seen of Virgin Punk, that it's also probably a little true of Virgin Punk. The context of his earlier work is so strong, still in like stuff he's doing right now, that it's inescapable. But you look at Studio Gynax is a perfect, especially early Studio, not Studio Gynax now. Studio Gynax now, the shambling nightmare that finally fell apart, and so Panty and Stocking got to go off to Trigger finally and get made again. Early Studio Gynax coins the Gynax, the jiggle physics that are exclusively and lovingly handcrafted at Studio Gynax. That tradition was carried on into shows like Kill, into shows like Panty and Stocking by Studio Trigger. There are real advantages to having shows that could be made with the idea of constraints. Famously, Matthew Weiner, the creator of Mad Men, the original person who originally created the concept behind Mad Men, said at some point, hey, this is going to... He pitched it to HBO. HBO said no. And then he pitched it because he thought it was the right fit for HBO. HBO said no. Then he pitched it to AMC. And what he ended up saying was the constraints put on him by being on just cable television, not specifically something like or network television, not something like HBO, which is cable television, is that he had to do things with sex scenes. Instead of showing the sex scene, which of course he would have if it was an HBO show, he had to show immediately before and immediately after. He had to show what led to that scene and the consequences of it. And that's part of what makes that show much more interesting on like a lurid level than something like Game of Thrones, which feels like, oh, we gotta have a boob every 5 seconds, every couple minutes, or else people will stop paying attention. But I'm gonna take a break right here to change the battery on the camera and probably throw something in here. But when I come back, we'll wrap it up. Now, where does all this leave us in terms of what this show is? It is a standard formula hobby-ganda anime with unendingly incredible production values. And if you watch Ruri Rocks for no other reason than I think you should watch it, not because it'll give you an education or science, it will. Not because it's a hobby-ganda anime, but because it is unendingly gorgeous. And just the craft of it is worth putting in your eye holes. And like I said, these hobby-ganda anime, because they have so little going on in terms of high-octane stakes necessarily, they need a level of quality, quite frankly, a Naruto can get away with not having, because you're only focused on the one thing. You're not watching a big fight scene, or a fight scene like in May I Ask for One Final Thing, where it's okay if they just show through it a little bit. You're watching a show that's supposed to lovingly portray a hobby, or maybe even the beginnings of a profession. And that's really the last thing I want to talk about here, because I think it's a really interesting turn that the show does really quickly and really convincingly. The show hints at it a little bit earlier with Shoko's character, but towards the end of the show, they do, and this is a common thing, it's less common in American schools, but it's incredibly common in Japanese schools, and the way you know that is you see it in so many anime, especially in school settings, is you get a sheet, you get what's called a career sheet, and you have to fill out what your future aspirations are, what you want to be in the future. And very often in these shows, in any anime, main character will have issues filling out their career sheet, or they just won't do it, or they're like Iyashikei Urameshi and they just don't go to school, so they don't get it at all. And this show's version of that is picking the electives and telling the staff of the school why you want to pick that elective. And Ruri's struggling with it, because in her mind, and it's pitched to her by her teachers, as thinking about your future. And she doesn't really think that hard about her future. And the show up until now has shown her essentially being a gem otaku in the way that Bishki is, but being incredibly proactive with it. And she's at the point where she is, on her weekends, spending 500 yen to go on the bus to college to hang out with college kids and do research on minerals. She knows what she wants to do with her life, but no one outside of her little bubble is explicitly treating it that way. And in the episode where they start to introduce Shoko as a character, if you're watching the show, she's a pink-haired girl in the beginning. They have a flashback with Shoko where they show Shoko's parents having a private conversation that Shoko wasn't supposed to hear, and they're really concerned because their kid is really into finding minerals and all this stuff. And the wife is like, it's kind of cute and cool. And the husband's like, but I wouldn't want her to pick it up as a profession because I don't know how much money there is in that. And the wife agrees, and that creates this sore point of trauma in Shoko up until we meet her in the show, basically. There can be a tendency of adults to discourage, whether intentionally or unintentionally very often, things that they don't see as useful. Perfect example is, for very many years, adults would say to kids, you can't make a living at playing video games. That has since been proven wrong. But there's a period of time when that was true, and in the past, and that's what adults are speaking to. You can't make a living doing this stuff. Or if you can, it's not a very good living, and people are trying to look out for you. I had the advantage of growing up in a really creatively minded household. And not just a creatively minded household, but a household that was built off of money earned from creative professions and earned from working in the creative industries. And I have done that my entire life. When I said I wanted to be a video game designer as a kid, my mom wasn't someone who said, oh, you can't do that, or she wasn't someone who was worried about me not being able to be successful at that. She knew it was possible because she did a variant of something creative and out there plenty of times, and she made that kind of money. But I was really lucky. And I remember going to my 5-year high school reunion. I didn't go to my 10-year. Your 10-year, it's a scary one. That's the one they go to in Romy and Michelle's high school reunion. Your 5-year one is really fun because you're all still 20. You all still have livers that aren't fucked. You just face, in our case, I went to a very upscale high school. We went to a bar and we drank that bar under the table. When I say that, we went to a bar for our 5-year high school reunion, and we drank so much at that bar that they kicked us out, even though they said we paid for an unlimited tap. They just said, you drank us into the red, you need to go. That bar is now closed, for the record. Gee, wonder why, but we straight up were like, let's go somewhere else and drink somewhere else now. And then we literally crashed some other's high school reunion. It was wild. But when I went to that high school reunion, something weird happened to me that I had foreshadowed for me years earlier. And that was all these people who I knew, they were in my graduating class. I was passing friends with some of them. Came up to me and said, I looked up to you so much when I was in high school. You were the creative kid. You were the kid who was clearly going to be a creative person, and I never had that. I thought it was so cool. And, like, part of that is we were all fucking 15 to 18-year-olds and assholes in high school, so of course we weren't going to be like, oh, it's so cool that you can draw, man. Like, that's not a thing that high school is very often, at least when I was in high school, said to each other. But the other part of it was, I saw that I had a support structure that allowed me to explore that. And in the Shoko story, it's not that her parents weren't trying to be supportive and didn't want to support her hobbies and stuff. It's that they were worried she was going to over-focus on it and it was going to be her main thing for her life. And they were worried about what that would mean for her future. And the weird byproduct, I think, of non-hyper-individual cult of the individual culture that America has. In America, for a very long time, you could be whatever you... And this is still true. You can be whatever you want. If you want to be it, you can go to college for it, you can get a degree, or sometimes you don't even need a degree. For some people would argue oftentimes you don't need a degree. And you could be it. And that is part of your individuality, and exploring that stuff and getting a side hustle and all that shit is a very individualist thing. So we don't shy away from that stuff. In a much more collectivist, societal-minded environment, you get people who think about themselves in very different ways and who rely on having much more, what's the word for it? Explicitly capitalistic, explicitly advantageous careers. It's the way they think about their work life. They don't necessarily think about loving what they do. They think about maybe loving what they do, but also making the best paycheck. And that's what was happening in the conversation with Shoko's parents when Shoko overheard them. If they weren't necessarily trying to discourage their daughter from pursuing what she loves, that they were worried about the fact that if she goes into that, she'll be stuck in that, and she won't have a very full life. And I understand that inclination. But then we go back to modern day, and towards the end of the show, Nagi's struggling with thinking about her future. And she eventually says the things she's thinking out loud, and even you, the viewer, you're like, what the hell is she talking about? She says, I'm not a very smart person. I just like pretty rocks. This can't be a profession. Everybody in the room, it's like, oh, we all fucked up a little bit here. Did no one tell her that you can do this for money? And did no one tell her clearly enough that not only can you do this for money, but that she is good at this? That she is not just smart, but really talented at this. And a lot about science, a lot about the arts and sciences, can make you need to be skilled or talented. in order to be, you need to be talented or supremely intelligent is actually the best way to put it. Talented in terms of the arts or incredibly smart in terms of the sciences to pursue this stuff as a profession. And the show takes no question of showing that Nagi and Imari are truly skilled, like, college, even professional level earth scientists, essentially. But what it also is careful to do the entire time is the only reason why Ruri isn't that is because she doesn't have the experience yet. And that's very similar to the arts. Everybody wants to apply this idea of talent to artists. That's not true. If you hear someone refer to an artist as being incredibly talented and that's why they're so successful, they don't know what they're talking about. They just don't. Whether it's learned or inherited or instinctual, on display, artists and creatives, when they're doing incredible work, is an incredible amount of skill. And, in some cases, intuition. Talent could potentially not exist. A truly talented person will lose to an incredibly experienced and skilled person every day of the week. And what the show shows is worried about if she's smart enough. That's not the point. And Nagi tells her as much. She's like, that's not the point. Nagi and the show in the following episode, in the second to last episode, tell her as much. That's not the point. From the outside looking in at serious professional level sciences and coders and artists and all the kinds of people who build and maintain the world, you think that's unachievable. You think that's a thing you can't be. You think that you'll never get to the level of Mark Zuckerberg or Frida Kahlo or any incredible coder or artist or scientist. And Mark Zuckerberg notwithstanding, he started somewhere. There was a point at which Mark Zuckerberg did not know how to write a line of code. There was a point at which Bill Gates didn't know how to write a line of code. Famously, Steve Jobs did not know how to code. The equation that coded in the Steve Jobs of it all was Steve Wozniak. Steve Jobs came at it from a completely different approach and kind of proved you don't need to be a coder to be successful in that industry. In fact, very oftentimes it's better if you're not. I spent years working as a creative, and subsequently I spent years working with a lot of different coders. And eventually, I couldn't write a line of code, but I could look at a website, and I did this in a job where I was the interaction designer, and I would say to the coder, like, look, it needs to be this, not this. That's the problem. Once that's changed, all of this will work. And I remember that specifically, because, and it was at a fairly big fashion magazine, actually. I got a note from him, and he said, you have no idea how much I loved working with you. You're one of the best designers I've ever worked with. You convinced me that, like, I shouldn't be a designer, I should be a coder, and not try to do both constantly. I was only able to do that because I had an incredible amount of experience from a different job that allowed me to understand the possibility space in a way lots of people just don't. If you look at a website on your iPhone, you probably think, and you can probably do something not good, but you don't know how to fix it. Even if you have an idea, you don't know the technical term on what to say to somebody, more or less, or even what to do to fix that thing. I have that knowledge, but I only gained that through years of experience. And what Ruri, in the, like, back sort of the show is experiencing is she's experiencing this, like, middle ground of, I love this, I've been engaging with this stuff earnestly and honestly, but I can never see myself doing it because I constantly have these examples of people who are doing it at such a high level, a level that's so much higher than me. I could never be that. When in reality, it's like she's on the first rungs of the ladder and she can't see the rest of the ladder, that the rest of the ladder is clear. All she has to do is put one hand over the other, one foot over the other, and she'll get there. The ladder's not being pulled up after her. It's being held in place by people like Imari and by people like Nagi for her to get up there. And for her to be like up there with and learn the rest of the trade that she needs to learn to engage in the thing that she loves in a whole and meaningful way. I think that's a really great thing for these hobby-ganda shows to do that lots of them just don't do. Lots of them have that discovery phase of like discovering the hobby and discovering why it's great. Yuru Camp had that in spades. But they skip that middle part. And if you're like hobby-ganda Iyashikei shows, the reason I would watch Ruri Rocks is because it doesn't skip that middle part. It doesn't do what Yuru Camp did with this movie, which is they skip from, okay, we're all learning outdoor camping, to now we all kind of working and we all just kind of look at each other and decide to revive because we all love it. Ruri Rocks sits it down and says, like, you love this. Get to the place where you should pursue it. You love it with a passion at a level that you should be pursuing this. You'll get to the professionalized version of it. That's time. But you're well on your way to doing that. You're farther than most people will ever get. You have successfully gone down the path of hobbyists close to professional grade. You just need a little bit more. I think that's really because so many people think they can't do stuff when really it's just about putting one foot in front of the other. And so many people look at people who are doing things and they think, oh, there's no way I could figure out a 3D printer. Of course you can. There's no way I could code a website. Of course you can. There's no way I could, find the freaking opal deposit. Of course you can. It just takes time and giving yourself the time to learn and grow into it. And that's really kind of what this show, aside from the craft of it made, is that it's so much about learning and growing into a hobby and seeing where in a way that's not often that's not very often you come in at the beginning or the end, because that's where the things I was talking about earlier are of the giant big your first big of a mineral or a giant or the end where you're old hat and where you're old hat and you are the teacher who is teaching people. There's this middle part where you're just take art as an example, where you're okay at drawing. You're not great at it yet. You haven't really developed your own style. But if you just push a little bit more, you'll get there. You'll learn more. You'll grow more. And then after all that, they do the last episode and they out scope of possibilities in Ruri's eyes, which I find really incredible. They also use their last episode as the most Blu-ray commercial freaking Hot Springs episode I've seen in a while. Just steam everywhere, everybody's naked, let's sell some Blu-rays, let's print some and get some stuff in some otaku and let's go. But kind of doing the little random mystery moment of that episode, the next thing they focus on is finding meteorites. And what that looks like, how you can go to and kind of find a meteorite and find a piece of a space rock. And they make it just as nerdy as they made the entire show. But at that point, at least for me as a viewer, the thing I was getting joy out of was the character's excitement to go for it, embark on this, and they get a level of they with our bars so they could plug them in and use them. It's so it's endearing. It's great. And that's actually where I'm going to leave it. So, yeah.
Hey, I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and if you did, be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. If you're listening to it on a podcast platform and they allow you to give a 5-star review, be sure to do that. If you're watching this on YouTube and you really liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the video. In addition, if you want to make sure that you don't miss a beat, be sure to hit that notification bell so you know when new episodes drop. But if you're wondering, they drop every Thursday night Eastern time. And on that note, if you really love the podcast and you really love what I'm trying to do here, be sure to give the website a look. That website is bento-box.ghost.io. There will be a link in the description of either this podcast or this video. It'll also be linked in the description of the entire podcast on the information page. It'll also be linked in the description of the YouTube channel. So there's plenty of ways for you to get to that website and check it out. If you want to follow me, my social links are also listed in the footer of that page. So once again, go over there to find that stuff. But I hope you like the episode. I look forward to talking to you next time. But until next time, I have been Alex. This has been Bento Radio, and I'll talk at you later.